In the last section, we got a better sense of how io.copy is working. Now, the very last thing that I want to do around interfaces is to try to write our own custom type that implements the writer interface, and then pass that custom type off to this io.copy function. And so it'll give us a really good idea of what the writer interface is doing. Now, before we get started, let's pull up the documentation again around the writer interface. So I'm back at package.io. I'll scroll on down to the index section and then go all the way down to the bottom here where I'll find type writer. So in order to satisfy the writer interface, we have to create a new custom type that has a function associated with it called write. And that function needs to take an argument of a byte slice and return an integer and an error. So let's flip back over to our code editor. Right above the main function, we're now going to create this new custom type that we'll use to associate this write function. So we'll say type log writer. So I'm going to give our custom type a name of log writer. Just completely randomly choosing this. We do not have to specifically call it anything we want. I just think log writer makes sense. This is going to be a struct that has no fields associated with it. And then down underneath our main function, we'll define the write function that takes log writer as a receiver. So we'll say func log writer write, and notice that this has a capital W. It'll receive an argument of a byte slice, which we'll call BS, short for byte slice, and then we'll annotate it with a type of byte slice. And then after that, we'll specify the two return types of this function, which are going to be an integer and an error. Okay, so remember, by just defining this function right here and associating it with log writer, the log writer is now implementing the writer interface. It's now implementing this interface because log writer has a function called write that receives a byte slice as an argument and returns an int and an error. So this is one of those things where you recall way long ago when we were talking about some big notes around our interfaces. Where are they? Right here. Remember that we had said that interfaces are a contract to help us manage types. So it's entirely possible for us to write interfaces or to write functions that implement an interface in an incorrect fashion. In case in point, I'll show you exactly an example of that right now. So let's say that rather than doing anything with the byte slice right here, let's say, hey, let's just write some function that implements the writer interface but doesn't actually do what the writer interface is intended to do. So maybe I will just return an integer, because that is required, and then a nil error. So I'll say nil like so. So now I'll save this program, and rather than passing off os.standardout, we are going to pass a value of type log writer. So right above io.copy, I'll say log writer, LW for short, is going to be log writer, and we'll create a value of that type by placing the, remember, curly braces right after it. And then we're going to pass in the log writer to the first argument of io.copy here. So now, as far as io.copy is concerned, log writer, LW right here, is a value that implements the writer interface because it has a function called write that takes a byte slice and returns an int and an error. But remember, all this interface stuff is like a loose suggestion to just help us figure out what functions and what types match up where. But if we still put together a junk or crap implementation that doesn't actually work or doesn't do the right thing, everything's still going to compile and it's still going to run, but our program is probably not going to do what it actually is intended to do. So these interface things are like a contract that help us manage all the types, and they don't necessarily require us to actually write code that makes our application truly work the way we expect. So just to prove that to you, let's compile and run this application and see what happens. So I'll go back over to my terminal. We'll do our go run main.go, and then you'll notice just absolutely nothing happens here. Okay, eventually it returns. And so as far as you and I are concerned, well, the program compiled, it successfully ran, but clearly it did not actually do the right thing. So remember, interfaces are to help guide you down the right path, but they don't necessarily make sure that you write exactly correct code. All right, so now back on track. Let's make sure that we actually do this thing correctly. So we're going to put together an implementation inside of write that actually takes all the data inside this byte slice and prints it out to the command line. So we're going to say format.println. we're going to take that byte slice, turn it into a string. So we'll say string byte slice like so. And then we'll return an integer and an error. But this time we're going to return the correct values. And so this is where you really start to have to read the documentation around the writer interface. So if we go back to our documentation, you'll notice that this integer number right here is supposed to return the number of bytes that was written from the byte slice, or that argument p. So they're calling the byte slice here p. So we're supposed to return as the first argument an integer that represents the number of bytes that we just successfully processed. And so in our case, with this single statement right here, we really are processing all of the data inside of the byte slice. So we can return just the length of the byte slice. That says, hey, we just processed the entire thing. And then as a second argument, we'll pass a nil to say we didn't have any error as we did it. Now, just to show you how we can put together these custom implementations that kind of match up with these different interfaces, let's add it in a second line here, a second print statement that says just wrote this many bytes. And then we'll pass in length of byte slice. So now we have a very custom implementation of the writer interface that still prints out all the data to the terminal, so it truly does what we expect something that implements the writer interface to do, and it also matches the writer interface implementation. Okay, so last step, let's flip back over, we'll run this. We get the same printout as before, and then we also get this extra little custom error message, or excuse me, status message, not error message, that says that we just wrote out 10,403 bytes. Okay, so that pretty much closes it up for interfaces. Now at this point, we really covered interfaces, really two topics at the same time. We spoke about the reader and writer stuff, and we also spoke about more about interfaces themselves. And so I know that this has been a really nasty section, but again, just like I said in the last video or two, this is some of the really top end or very heavy, very in-depth, very complicated Go stuff. And even though this has been really nasty and hard to understand, I am very convinced that when you go off to start writing your own program, you're now going to have a much better sense of what all this reader and writer stuff is. Because again, I can't say it enough, you're going to see reader and writer all over the place with Go applications. Okay, so I think that we're probably at a place now where we could really benefit from maybe a quiz to kind of reinforce some of the stuff that we learned about interfaces. So let's take a quick break. We'll come back to the next section and we'll take care of a couple of quiz questions and really kind of cement all this knowledge. So see you in just a minute.